My name is Alexander Hayes, and I never expected to find love on the high seas. As a seasoned sailor with 10 years of experience, I thought I'd seen everything the ocean had to offer. But when I joined the crew of the Windward Spirit, I discovered how wrong I was. I first met Captain James Montgomery during the hiring process in Portsmouth. He cut an impressive figure in his naval uniform, tall, broad-shouldered, with storm-gray eyes and dark hair peppered with silver at the temples. Though he couldn't have been more than 40, there was a weathered wisdom to his features that spoke of countless voyages. "Your credentials are impressive, Mr. Hayes," he said, reviewing my papers. "But tell me, why leave your previous position on the Aurora?" I shifted in my chair, aware of his intense gaze. "I needed a change, sir. The Aurora's routes had become predictable." A slight smile tugged at his lips. "You seek adventure, then?" "I seek challenge, Captain. The opportunity to prove myself." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Welcome aboard the Windward Spirit, Mr. Hayes. We sail with the morning tide." The Windward Spirit was a magnificent vessel, a three-masted bark that carried both cargo and a handful of wealthy passengers between England and the Americas. As first mate, I would be second only to Captain Montgomery himself. Those first few weeks at sea were a dance of sorts. The captain and I worked closely together, our daily interactions marked by a growing awareness of each other. I found myself noticing small details, the way his hands moved as he plotted our course on maps, how his voice changed when giving orders in rough weather, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. One night, about a month into our voyage, I found him alone on deck, staring at the stars. "Beautiful night, sir," I said, moving to stand beside him at the rail. "Indeed it is, Mr. Hayes." He glanced at me. "Alexander, may I call you Alexander?" The informality surprised me. "Of course, Captain. James," he corrected softly. "When we're alone, at least." Something shifted between us in that moment, like the changing of the tide. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight dance on the waves. "I've read your previous captain's reports," he said eventually. "They all praise your skill, your dedication, but none of them mention how observant you are. Sir, I've noticed you watching me, Alexander, with those keen green eyes of yours." My heart stuttered. "It's all right," he said, his voice low. "I've been watching you too." That night marked the beginning of something both thrilling and dangerous. During the day, we maintained strict professionalism. I was the first mate, he was the captain, and nothing more. But in the quiet hours of night watch, we began sharing pieces of ourselves. I learned that James had joined the Merchant Marine at 16, following in his father's footsteps. He'd never married to the sea as he put it, though I sensed there was more to that story. He learned about my childhood in Cornwall, my mother's death, my early years working on fishing boats. We were careful, so careful. A lingering glance here, a brush of hands there, always aware of the crew's eyes. The sea is rife with superstition, and relationships between men were still taboo, especially between a captain and his subordinate. One evening, as I delivered the day's reports to his cabin, James asked me to stay for a glass of brandy. It wasn't unusual for a captain to share a drink with his first mate, but there was something different in his eyes that night. "Do you know what drives me mad, Alexander?" he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Watching you on deck, so capable, so confident. The way you handle the crew, the way you move about the ship like you were born to it." Heat crept up my neck. "Captain?" "James," he reminded me. "We're alone." He set down his glass and stepped closer. I could smell the brandy on his breath, mixed with the ever-present scent of sea salt and leather that clung to him. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his hand coming up to cup my cheek. "Tell me I'm wrong about what's growing between us." Instead of answering, I closed the distance between us. The first brush of his lips against mine was gentle, questioning. Then his arms were around me, and there was nothing gentle about it anymore. Years of hidden desires and stolen glances poured into that kiss, leaving us both breathless. "We have to be careful," he murmured against my mouth. "If anyone discovers—" "I know." I pulled back slightly, though my hands remained on his chest. "We risk everything. Is it worth it?" His eyes searched mine. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "You're worth it." The weeks that followed were a sweet torture. We stole moments when we could, a passionate embrace in his locked cabin, a secret touch as we reviewed charts together, heated glances across the deck that left me aching. But we had to be vigilant. The crew couldn't suspect, especially not the more conservative members who might cause trouble. Then came the storm warnings. The barometer had been dropping steadily for days, and the sky to the northwest had taken on that sickly green tinge that experienced sailors' dread. James called me to his cabin to discuss our options. We could try to outrun it, I suggested, studying the charts. Change course for no, he shook his head. Look at these pressure readings. This is going to be a monster, Alexander. We need to prepare to face it head on. He was right, of course. We spent the next hours battening down everything that could move, securing the cargo, and briefing the crew. All the while, the sky grew darker and the wind began to howl. The storm hit with devastating force just after sunset. Massive waves crashed over the bow, and the wind screamed through the rigging like a banshee. The Windward Spirit pitched and rolled violently as we fought to keep her headed into the waves. All hands on deck. James's voice carried even over the howling wind. He stood at the helm, his greatcoat whipping around him, looking every inch the captain he was. Mr. Hayes, secure those main sheets. I scrambled across the deck, barking orders to the crew as we struggled to prevent the sails from shredding in the gale. The rain was coming sideways now, stinging like needles against my face. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos around us in stark flashes. That's when I saw it, a monster wave bearing down on us from the port side. Brace for impact, I shouted, but my warning was lost in a tremendous crash as the wave struck. The ship lurched violently and I lost my footing. I slammed into the rail hard enough to knock the breath from my lungs. Before I could regain my balance, another wave swept across the deck. The world tilted, and suddenly I was airborne, then underwater. The cold was shocking, paralyzing. In the darkness, I couldn't tell which way was up. Then strong hands grabbed me, hauling me back onto the deck. It was James. He'd tied himself to the ship with a safety line and jumped in after me. We collapsed together on the deck, gasping. "Don't you dare," he growled in my ear, his arms tight around me. "Don't you dare leave me like that." There was no time for more. The storm was far from over, and the ship needed us. For hours we battled the elements, working in seamless coordination. The crew's respect for their captain grew as they watched him work alongside them, taking the same risks, enduring the same hardships. Dawn finally broke to reveal a sea that was gradually calming, though still dangerously rough. The Windward Spirit had survived, but not without damage. The foretop gallant had been torn away, and we'd lost some cargo, but miraculously, no lives. As the crew began the cleanup, James ordered me to his cabin to assess the damage reports. The moment the door closed behind us, he pulled me into a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured into my wet hair. "When I saw you go over—" "I'm here," I assured him, clinging just as tightly. "I'm safe." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands framing my face. "I love you," he said roughly. "God help me. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone or anything, including this ship." My heart soared even as fear gripped me. Love between men like us was dangerous enough on land. At sea, it could be deadly. But looking into his storm-gray eyes, I knew I couldn't deny my feelings any longer. "I love you too," I whispered. "Whatever comes, whatever we have to face, I love you." His kiss was desperate, passionate, full of the fear and relief we'd both experienced during the storm. We knew we should stop, that someone could come looking for us at any moment, but neither of us could bear to let go. The days following the storm brought new challenges. The crew's respect for both James and me had grown after witnessing our actions during the crisis, but this made maintaining our professional distance even more crucial. Every shared glance, every accidental touch now seemed charged with dangerous possibility. The ship's carpenter, Mr. Thompson, had reported significant damage to the lower hull. We needed to make repairs, which meant finding a suitable port. James decided to divert our course to a small harbor in the Azores, well known for its discreet shipwrights and minimal official oversight. During the journey, I noticed one of the younger crew members, Timothy Walsh, watching us with an unsettling intensity. He was a sharp-eyed lad of 19, ambitious and clever, perhaps too clever for our comfort. "He knows something," I told James one night in his cabin, keeping my voice low despite the closed door. "The way he looks at us," James sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. I've noticed. We need to be more careful, more careful. I gave a bitter laugh. We barely speak to each other except about ship's business. I can't remember the last time He crossed the cabin in 2 strides, pulling me close. I know, it's torture for me too, but we can't risk. A knock at the door sent us springing apart. Captain? It was Walsh's voice. Sorry to disturb you, sir, but there's something you should see. James straightened his uniform jacket, composing himself. Enter. Walsh stepped in, his eyes flickering between us before settling on the captain. There's a problem with the cargo in Hold 3, sir. Water damage worse than we thought. I'll come have a look, James said. Mr. Hayes, please continue with the navigation calculations. I watched them leave, my heart pounding. The knowing look in Walsh's eyes had been unmistakable. The next few days were tense. Walsh seemed to appear everywhere, always watching, always listening. I began to notice him in whispered conversations with other crew members, conversations that would stop abruptly when I approached. Finally, we reached the Azores. The harbor was small but well-equipped, nestled in a protected cove. As the crew began unloading damaged cargo and the shipwrights assessed our hull, James called me to his cabin. We need to talk about Walsh, he said without preamble. He's been asking questions about you, about your previous positions, your relationship with past captains. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions? The kind that could ruin us both. James paced the cabin, his face drawn with worry. I've arranged for him to be transferred to another ship while we're in port. Called in a favor with an old friend who needs an experienced hand. Will that be enough? It has to be. He stopped pacing and faced me. Alexander, perhaps we should consider— Don't, I cut him off. Don't suggest we end this. I won't give you up. His expression softened. My brave, stubborn love. He reached for me, then let his hand fall. But what future can we have? Always hiding, always afraid of discovery. Whatever future we can make, I insisted. Together, the repairs in the Azores took nearly 2 weeks. Walsh was successfully transferred to another vessel, but his departure didn't entirely ease our concerns. The seed of suspicion he'd planted among some crew members remained. One evening, as I supervised the loading of fresh supplies, I overheard 2 sailors talking in low voices behind some crates. The way they look at each other, one was saying. And have you noticed how the captain never takes his meals with the passengers anymore? Always in his cabin with the first mate. I cleared my throat loudly, and they scattered like startled gulls. The incident left me shaken. That night, I slipped into James's cabin after most of the crew had retired. We're being careless, I said, pacing the small space. The crew is talking. James watched me from behind his desk, his face tired in the lamplight. Come here, he said softly. I went to him, and he pulled me onto his lap, his arms wrapping around my waist. Let them talk, he murmured, pressing his face into my neck. I'm tired of pretending you mean nothing to me. James, I sighed, melting into his embrace despite my fears. We can't. A sudden knock made us freeze. Captain? It was Mr. Rogers, the ship's doctor. Sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation with one of the passengers. We quickly separated, straightening our clothes. James called for Rogers to enter, and I adopted a professional stance by the navigation table. The doctor explained that one of our wealthy passengers, Mrs. Blackwood, had taken ill and required immediate attention. As he spoke, his eyes kept darting between James and me, and I noticed a slight frown on his weathered face. After Rogers left, James and I exchanged worried looks. He suspects, I said quietly. Rogers is a good man, James replied. He served with me for 5 years. But you're right. We can't keep taking these risks. The next day, we set sail again, continuing our journey to the Americas. The repaired ship cut through the waves smoothly, but the atmosphere on board had changed. There were whispers, sidelong glances, and a tension that hadn't existed before. I threw myself into my duties, keeping busy from dawn to dusk. James and I maintained a careful distance, speaking only when necessary and always in the presence of others. The separation was painful, but necessary. One night, about a week after leaving the Azores, I was doing my final rounds when I heard voices from the crew's quarters. I paused outside, listening. Unnatural. That's what it is, someone was saying. Men like that don't belong at sea. Careful, another voice warned. The captain's got friends in high places. Doesn't make it right, though, does it? Him and the first mate. I walked away, my heart pounding. When I reached James's cabin to deliver my nightly report, I found him standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit waves. "They know," I said without preamble. "Or at least they think they know." He didn't turn around. I've heard the whispers too. What do we do? Now he did turn, and the love and pain in his eyes made my chest ache. What can we do? We're trapped on this ship with them for at least another month. I moved closer, wanting desperately to touch him, but knowing I couldn't. We could leave. When we reach port, find different ships. Is that what you want? No, I admitted. I want you. I want this ship. I want everything we've built together. The tension aboard the Windward Spirit continued to build over the next few days. I noticed certain crew members would refuse to take orders directly from me, instead waiting for confirmation from other officers. The passengers, too, seemed to have caught wind of the rumors. Mrs. Blackwood, in particular, would purse her lips disapprovingly whenever James and I were in the same vicinity. One morning, I found crude drawings and words scratched into my cabin door. I cleaned them off before anyone else could see them, but the incident left me shaken. That evening, during my report to James, I couldn't keep the tremor from my voice as I recounted the day's events. "This can't continue," James said, his hands clenched on his desk. "I won't have my first mate disrespected on my ship. What choice do we have?" I asked bitterly. "We can't exactly deny the rumors without drawing more attention to them." He stood abruptly, crossing to where I stood. Despite the risk, he took my hands in his. "I could transfer you to another ship, give you letters of recommendation so strong you could have your pick of positions." "No," I said firmly. "I won't be driven away by ignorance and prejudice. Alexander." He touched my face gently. "I can't bear to see you suffer for loving me." A knock at the door forced us apart once again. This time, it was Mr. Rogers, and when he entered, his expression was grave. "Captain Mr. Hayes," he said, closing the door behind him. "I feel I must speak frankly. The crew's morale is deteriorating. There's talk of writing to the shipping company once we reach port." James's face hardened. "Are you delivering a threat, Doctor?" "No, sir," Rogers replied quietly. "A warning from someone who respects you both. The sea is dangerous enough without adding the threat of a mutinous crew." After Rogers left, James and I stood in heavy silence. "He's right," I finally said. "We're putting everyone at risk, the crew, the passengers, the cargo." "Don't." James's voice was rough. "Don't make this sound so simple. It's not simple. It's breaking my heart." I moved toward the door. "But we have a duty to this ship and everyone aboard her." "Alexander, wait." But I was already gone, closing the door on his words and my own desperate desire to stay. The next few days were a special kind of hell. We maintained absolute professional distance, speaking only when necessary, never alone. I threw myself into my duties with almost manic intensity, working from before sunrise until well after sunset. The crew noticed the change, and gradually the whispers began to die down. Then came the second storm. It wasn't as severe as the first, but it hit us at night, catching several crew members off guard. As I helped secure the main deck, a loose rope from the rigging whipped across my face, opening a gash above my eye. Blood ran into my vision, but I kept working until James appeared and forcibly relieved me of duty. "Get below and let Rogers see to that," he ordered, his captain's voice brooking no argument. In the doctor's cabin, as Rogers stitched my wound, he spoke quietly. "You know, I've served under Captain Montgomery for many years. Never seen him care about anyone the way he cares about you." I stayed silent, unsure how to respond. "The sea," Rogers continued, tying off the last stitch, "has its own rules, its own morality. Out here, what matters is competence, courage, and loyalty. Everything else is just human foolishness." Rogers's words stayed with me through the night. As dawn broke, I stood at the rail, watching the storm-tossed waters gradually calm. James appeared beside me, maintaining a proper distance, but close enough for quiet words. "Your face," he started. "It's fine," I cut him off. "Rogers did a good job. We're 2 days from port," he said after a moment. "I've been thinking—" "Don't," I replied softly. "Not yet, but fate had other plans." That afternoon, as I was reviewing cargo manifests in my cabin, there was a knock. It was Mrs. Blackwood, of all people. "Mr. Hayes," she said, entering without invitation. "I believe we need to talk." My heart sank, but I maintained my professional demeanor. "How may I help you, madam?" She closed the door and fixed me with a penetrating stare. "My late husband was a ship's captain," she said unexpectedly. For 30 years, he served the same company, earned their respect, their trust, and for 28 of those years, his first mate was more than just his officer. I felt the blood drain from my face. They were discreet, she continued, professional, dedicated to their ship and their crew. No one ever had cause to complain about their conduct. She paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Mr. Hayes? I believe I do, madam. She nodded. Good. Now, I believe I overheard some crew members planning to report certain suspicions to the company when we reach port. It would be a shame if their credibility were questioned by a wealthy passenger's written testimony about their exemplary professional conduct throughout the voyage. That evening, I requested a private meeting with James in his cabin. When I told him about Mrs. Blackwood's visit, he sat heavily in his chair. So there are others, he said quietly. Other men like us, serving with honor. It seems so. I moved closer, resting my hand on his shoulder. James, I've been thinking. Maybe we don't have to choose between duty and love. Maybe we just need to be smarter, more careful. He covered my hand with his. The crew still suspects. Let them suspect, as long as we give them no proof, no cause for complaint about our professional conduct. I knelt beside his chair. I'm not ready to give up everything we've built together. Nor am I, he admitted, finally allowing himself to touch my face, careful of the stitches. But it won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is. 2 days later, we made port. True to her word, Mrs. Blackwood submitted a glowing letter about the ship's officers to the company. Several crew members did file complaints, but without evidence and against such a respected passenger's testimony, they were dismissed. We sailed together for another 5 years. There were still whispers, still suspicious looks, but we learned to live with them. We maintained our professional distance during the day, earned our crew's respect through competence and dedication, and found our moments of happiness in the quiet hours between watches. The sea, as Rogers had said, has its own rules. And in the end, it was the sea that judged us worthy, not by whom we loved, but by how well we served her. Years later, when I had my own command, I sometimes thought back to those days on the Windward Spirit. James had retired by then, living quietly in a cottage by the coast. I would visit when I could, and we would sit together watching the waves, no longer having to hide what we meant to each other. The sea had taught us many things: courage, patience, discretion. But most importantly, it taught us that love, like the tide, cannot be commanded or contained. It can only be navigated with skill and care through whatever storms may come.